Thank you very much for having me. This seminar, the whole program, my only regret is that I'm a little far from Pittsburgh and I cannot come and participate in all the seminars. I'm sure I would learn a very great deal. Because now that you told people my age,
No.
well, close enough to it. I can say that I'm still being carded in Whole Foods when I buy a bottle of wine. So I asked them if they thought I was too old. Never, exactly, never too old to drink. And I'll put in one other plug to my book called Alienated Minority, the Jews in Medieval Latin Europe. And it's actually, the reason I'm putting in the plug is that it's a good place to begin where the beginning really should be, which is that what you read of mine about the ghetto is really I don't want to call it a culmination, but it has to do with a perspective. You have to have continuity when you write history. You can't just begin, I mean, there are books that have dealt with Jewish conversion in Rome in the 18th century that begin as though the history began in the year 1700. And so they come up with things like the concept of favor of the faith, favor fide, which I write about, as though it was invented, extrajudicial, the author said. What extrajudicial? There's a book somebody wrote a few years ago, Favor Fide in Gratian. Gratian is 11th century, early 12th century. So you have to have that, and my perspectives and my reading of papal documents are also based on that, and the reading of law is based on that. You have to have a real continuity. But in any case, it's not a bad book to use in teaching, by the way, The Alienated Minority. Well, I'm very proud of it, actually. That's and I saw you got a good laugh out of the Jewish Dogs title, but if you get into the book, you'll see that it's a book about purity and impurity. Now, a few years ago, Wendy said that I spend time in Argentina. I have the privilege of being married to an Argentinian, and we go every year to visit her family. And a number of years ago, we went to Salta. Salta is in the north of Argentina. The population is, how shall I put it, Indian, native. I don't know quite how to put it, because once you get to Buenos Aires, it's 90% European.
Indigenous.
Indigenous. Okay, I have to get the right terminology, because as you know, they did to the native. I don't want to call them native Argentinians. It just doesn't seem to make sense. But they did to them roughly what was done in the United States. It may have even been worse to the Mapuche and so on. Well, I'm there, and it's Corpus Christi Day. Now, it's very religious, very pious, and the bishop is out on the church, the cathedral lawn in front of the entire town is there, and he's preaching. There was religion. I thought he was an employee of Francisco Franco, to tell you the truth. No, I mean that was my immediate reaction. Here he is, the two together, the nation, the religion, it's all one. There's absolutely no division. And the junta in the early 70s, which my wife lived through, fortunately untouched, but they too were very much based, as Franco was, on this union of the church and the state. And at the end of his talk, they distributed communion to everybody, and this was public. This was a public ceremony. And then they did a rogation. Beating of bounds, it's sometimes called. Maybe you've read about it in Natalie Davis's absolutely spectacular article on Protestant and Catholic concepts of holiness in Lyon, which may be one of the best articles you could ever read, not only for its content, but for the methodology. There's this much text and this much footnotes. So when she gets to her brilliant ideas, you know that they're serious. And there they were. It's marching around the town, led by priests, describing a holy district. That brings us to what the ghetto is really about, to the concerns that forward a ghetto. Now, I know I read the papers of Bernie Cooperman and Ben Ravid, and I know their work over the years, of course, as they know mine. And Bernie's right. ghetto does have something to do with urban structure. If you read Donatella Calabi in Italian, you'll find that there's negotiation for ghettos and how they're going to build them and how they're going to structure them. Absolutely. And Ben Ravid is also right. Ghettos have to do, certainly there are economic issues involved in ghettos. Ghettos are very, very complex issues because you're dealing with complex populations. You're dealing with a remnant of the Jewish population in Europe. There's none left except in the East, and what's in Germany, it's really a mess anyway by this time. There are very few. We don't really know how many. I've seen estimates as low as 5,000. They're scattered all around different governmental institutions. There is sort of what's going to become a ghetto in Frankfurt, but the only place that there are Jews in Western Europe is Italy. And it's only the north of Italy. The conditions in northern Italy, as you know at this time, it's not a united place, it's completely divided up. And in this divided up area of Italy, you're going to have ghettos structured with different purposes and different reasoning. But, and I think this is the thing that really has to be stressed, in all of them there is the scarlet thread that runs through. And even going to Venice, what is at Venice that's so important? When they have a debate, should we let the Jews stay permanently in the city? When you talk about bounds and sacred entities, how many of you have been in Venice? Many, I'm sure, okay? And you know, it's islands, right? I once flew over it. It's incredible to see it from the air. It's just this group of islands. So it is bounded. It is. And if you read Guido Ruggiero, a wonderful historian, he talks about the holy city of Venice, and he talks about a decapitation and a dismembering to deconstruct and reconstruct the holiness of the city. It is not a purely religious concept the way we think a purely religious concept. You go to church, you go to synagogue, you go to a mosque, and you walk out and you live a secular life reputatively, or you can if you so choose. But not in the Middle Ages, and not in the early modern period, and to a large extent not well into the modern period. And of course, somebody here I expect them to come up and say, and not in certain parts of the United States today, like the Supreme Court. Think of the makeup of the Supreme Court. It's very interesting. The founding fathers would have been astounded. Yeah, there are no Protestants. So this concept of a holy body, it's very much there, and it's in all of them. Now, how is the holy body put together? This is really the issue, because society is supposed to emulate Christ. Christ is an unbroken body. I once had this theory, it's one of these fun theories that you play around with, that the reason the Italian governments kept breaking apart and reforming was that the body had to be entire and pure and holy, and if you had a big dispute that you couldn't resolve, you had to break it apart and reconstruct it and make it all over again. Whereas Jews, by the way, have never really developed these concepts of body, because there's no body to emulate. And therefore governments can be almost like family feuds and still stick together, as families tend to do. So that this is the crucial point that I can go over and over again. But not only is it there, if I say something that isn't clear, not only that, but laws grow up over time in order to control those issues, those elements in society which would break apart the holy body. And you see that in terms of the Jews. People, when they study Jewish history in the Middle Ages, they say, well, through the Crusades, things were quiet. Augustine said, don't kill the Jews, so nobody killed the Jews. And then after the Crusades, everybody said, let's kill the Jews. And the Fourth Lateran Council, the big bad Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 came along and it put these terrible laws on the Jews. It doesn't work that way. If you read the texts carefully and slowly, you're building a whole series of laws which are codified. The fine canonist John Gilchrist in Volume 3 of Jewish History put out a table of all the laws. And they're easily accessible in Amnon Linder's collection of early modern laws on the Jews. The book is this thick. It's there. Restructures are there. And the main issue is not being polluted by over contact with Jews. Not eating with them. If you read the letters of the 9th century Agobard of Lyon, don't eat with the Jews. This is the worst of all possible crimes, to eat with a Jew. It contaminates you. It contaminates you because you're going to take the Eucharist. And what happens when, this is what the Fourth Lateran does, when the Eucharist becomes obligatory, as it does from 1215, then they have to protect through the church. Okay, they have to protect through the church, but it's things that are already on the books. There's nothing there that isn't already there except for the clothing, which is just another means of making sure that people don't sleep with Jews or eat with them. Because sleeping with a Jew is even worse, the exchange of fluids and so on and so forth. Okay, so though the ghetto is indeed fulfills many functions, and though it's very complex, you can't get away from this issue of the seeking of maintaining whole the Corpus Christi, whether the Corpus Christi is of the society itself, whether it's the Corpus Mysticum of the church, whether it's the Corpus Christi of the town. It doesn't matter. All of these places call themselves Corpus Christi in one way or another. It has to be protected. And the Jew is suspected. The Jew is suspected of a ritual murder. The Jew is suspected, and the phrasing goes that every year King Philip Augustus of France, at the end of the 12th century, heard that every year the Jews sacrificed and took communion with the heart of a Christian boy. That's not, it's not a loose translation or a paraphrase. That's the exact line. In other words, the Jews were flipping the Christian ritual on its head. They were doing terrible things to Christian ritual, and they were polluting it. The Jews, of course, said the other thing the other way around, which only made matters, matters a little worse, although they would have been the same anyway. And of course, this helps in Mariology, because when a Jewish father is going to kill his Jewish child who is liable to convert, who comes and saves the child? The virgin. Who else? So it fits into all the issues. You have pictures of Christian martyrs, because the martyr is also a Eucharist. The martyr is always the Eucharist, and the martyr is who dies. The ritual murder victim dies for Christ, in the name of Christ, in place of Christ, as though the martyr is actually fulfilling the salvific mission of Jesus. And this is something which they've actually debated. Okay. Now, as we move on, we move to the time of the ghettos themselves. What element comes in the ghetto that seems not to have been there before, but was there before, of course, like everything else? It just becomes more to the fore, and that's the question of conversion. Now, when the bull, first ghetto, of course, is Venice. And as I said, issues of body are there. But when the bull Cum Nimus Absurdum comes out, Paul IV comes up with a formula in 1555 that the Jews are tolerated to the very end that, ad hoc ut, he couldn't be stronger in Latin, to this very end we keep the Jews, to convert them. This is after he said that the Jews are doing terrible things. Well, if you think of those terrible things in a vacuum, then they remain what they are. But if you put them in the context of this fear that's by now 1,500 years old, the pollution of the body, the Jews are polluting the body. How can we allow them to pollute the body when we're trying to do what Paul says that ultimately is supposed to happen? They're supposed to convert. We must lead them by kindness. And to the end that is either fitting or that they agree that it's proper for them to go into a ghetto. They get expelled into a ghetto because Pope can't expel Jews. That's just totally against 1,500 years of history. And again, not because Augustine said something, which he may or may not have said. Well, he did say it, but nobody was citing him. Nobody was using him until Innocent III in 1215. So it certainly had nothing to do with the early Middle Ages. So he said, we have to do something. And it's part of an entire program. And you can see the development of this formula, that we tolerate Jews to this point, over about 80 years in a series of letters that have to do with accepting Jewish taxation. I once took the time and traced them and wrote a book on it. In other words, this is something that's new, but it's there. There have been attempts to convert, but they've been flaccid. a little here, a little there. Perhaps in Spain in the 13th century there's some attempts, but the popes are still tentative. They're not quite willing to do things like forcing the Jews to preach, to hear preaching. There's a famous letter from 1278, Vinium Sorek, in which Nicholas III says, yes, the Franciscans can preach to the Jews. And if the Jews don't come, write to me and I'll think of the solution. Let me tell you, I mean, that's what it says. Let me tell you, that's not the way papal letters end. They usually end, or always end, and if they don't do it, we're going to shorten them from the neck up. Or at least, have inquisitions or this or that or the other thing. Remember, there is such a thing as the Papal Inquisition from the 13th century. You've all read The Name of the Rose. You think that's, really tough stuff? Read the original documents. Echo actually toned the material down there. The Bernard Gui is not somebody you would have wanted to meet in real life, I assure you. Must have been crazy. So, in the 16th century, there is this change. Why is there this change? Well, the reasons are kind of obvious to a certain extent. The world is falling apart. But so is the church. It's not just that the world is falling apart, the unity that's being challenged by Henry VIII, who in a certain sense is even worse than Luther, because Luther's a heretic. Henry VIII stays a very proper Catholic in doctrine. It's Edward VI who changes the doctrine. Henry VIII just wants to get out from under the Pope because the Pope won't give him a divorce. So he maintains Catholic doctrine without the Pope. That's much more challenging. It's too close to home. Luther, it's off some other world there with crazy ideas, as the popes would see it. So the world is coming apart. The world is changing. The states are coalescing. The papal state itself is coalescing. And therefore, and on top of everything else, Paul IV himself is sure that the end of the world is going to be upon him. He and many others, in this book I did a few years ago, like in 1977, I traced at great length all the arguments, and the reformers within the church itself. This is very important. It's not just something coming from outside, it's coming from inside. The De Emendenda Ecclesia of Quarini and Giustiniani, the Sola Lezione of Francisco de Torres, they all say, they put heavy emphasis, we have to convert the Jews and we have to do it now. We have to have huge mission to the Jews, and the way to do it is by making them suck at husks through pious lashes. Piis verberibus, pious lashes. That's what the ghetto is supposed to do. And ultimately, we see that to a certain extent, it works. It works because when they closed the Jewish banks in 1682, which, as the Jews themselves tell us in the text from 1716, completely killed the economy. Because they said there's no capital. They said the word is capitalis sunt morti. There's no money in the ghetto for people to buy goods, to make investments, small investments, to carry on commerce, to carry on the artisanry, which has become so essential for Jewish life, or to print books either, Adam. And suddenly people are converting by whole families, which something you don't see before. And I think it affected the way Jews themselves react. So you've got this whole series of actions here, and as far as I'm trying to syncopate, because it's in the essay, as far as the progression goes, when we get into the 18th century, it's actually the worst. They're trying to suppress synagogues. They're suppressing a little area the Jews had outside the ghetto itself that they'd managed to maintain, where there was a synagogue called the Ghetto. There's a wonderful article that would come out by the late Giancarlo Spizzichino, who was just phenomenal at reading materials. Nobody really knows about these incidents, but he got them from archives. If you want to be a historian, you got to go in and read the archives, and you got to read the I's and the T's and whether they're crossed or uncrossed. That was a lesson I was very fortunately taught by a biblical scholar named H.L. Ginsberg, who used to yell at us at 8:30 in the morning for mispronouncing diacriticals. He was right. So the popes are getting what? But why? Because the world that was falling apart in the 16th century is really coming apart. And what's ultimately going to happen, and that's the third part of the paper, is that what's coming apart is the challenge to the supremacy of canon law. Canon law, and I'm sure you're going to ask me more about this, is embedded in a system called jus commune. The people are getting law degrees utriusque juris, of the two laws, canon law and civil law. Civil law being Roman law, not the law of torts, and common law not being British common law. It's a jus commune, common law. It's all together. The two are totally interdependent because they were interdependent from the time of Justinian and Theodosian in the 5th and the 6th century in the Christian Empire. And people are saying, wait a minute, shouldn't the civil law stand up against the canon law? And I have been tracing this at least as far as the Jews are concerned. And you can see it to a certain extent. It's easy to see it in the United States with all the fight about separation of church and state, which has nothing to do with Jews. Nothing at all to do with Jews. Bernard Bailyn of Harvard was the one who started to write about this with a great article in the American Historical Review about 40 years ago. It was a product of the people in Connecticut and in Rhode Island who were opposed to the Congregationalists of Massachusetts who were making laws. The church laws were the law of the land in Massachusetts. And they wanted none of this. And then when you get to James Madison, they're fighting for Baptists and Presbyterians. Baptists and Presbyterians, folks, not Jews, not Muslims, to be able to pray openly in Virginia, well into the 18th century. So that's where separation of church and state begins. And these guys were absolutely, talk about originalists. Who's more original than Madison, right? He wrote the Constitution. Can't be more original than that. He's livid about any attempt to put church and state together because he doesn't think that the United States can operate. He already sees. And one of the things they did, and some Americanists have told me they think I'm right when I say this, that they don't mention the Jews. Jews are never mentioned in the Constitution. They're emancipated ipso facto. Because if we give it to the Jews, then everybody else gets it. As simple as all that. And if we give it to the Jews without even mentioning them, because they knew what was going on in France and all the debates and so on and so forth, how much the more. Maybe this is an extreme interpretation. I wouldn't quite put it in the book that way. But in fact, it's there. And so there is this fight which goes on. And obviously, it has to do with the ghetto. It obviously has to do with are you going to be able to continue to really press Jews in the way that you're being pressed in the ghetto. And there's plenty of evidence for that. And then, of course, I didn't mention, and with this I bring my remarks to a close, and I didn't mention what the Jews are doing to avoid it, which is a very, very important thing. That is, they're taking what they had before the ghetto. This was the amazing thing. And they're perfecting it in order to maintain some kind of control over themselves, in order to maintain custom, in order to maintain family, in order to maintain community with a small c. Because community with a big C, a formally recognized community, well, it's there, but it isn't really working, and it's just to collect taxes for the Pope. By the way, you may be interested to know that in Italy and other places in Europe today, you either belong or don't belong to the Jewish community formally, and you pay taxes. You get a tax bill every year. And if you don't pay, the Italian state will come after you, unless you say you officially ask to be excluded from the community. Once you're in, you're in. So the Jews have I won't go back into it. I wrote a little bit about it. You can look at the theater of acculturation. The Jews are finding their own mechanisms to do it. So this is how everything kind of hangs together. I'm being much too brief, much too short here, of course, but I want, the essence is for you to discuss. You've read the paper, for you to discuss it with me.